The moment I walked into that gleaming corporate office, I could feel their eyes dissecting me like I was some kind of specimen under a microscope. "Can you repeat that?" the interviewer asked with barely concealed disdain when I introduced myself. "Your accent is quite thick." Little did they know, they were about to discover exactly who they were dismissing. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and for most of my life, I believed that in America, hard work and talent would speak louder than the sound of your voice or the color of your skin. I was born on a sweltering August morning in El Paso, Texas, to immigrant parents who came here with nothing but dreams packed in 2 worn suitcases and determination that ran deeper than the Rio Grande. My father, Miguel Rodriguez, had been a mechanical engineer in Guadalajara before he met my mother at a university library, where she worked while studying literature. When they married, they made the difficult decision to leave everything they knew behind: his established career, her extended family, the comfort of a place where their accents blended seamlessly with everyone else's. They crossed the border not as refugees from poverty, but as seekers of possibility, driven by the belief that their future children deserved opportunities that had no ceiling. In El Paso, my father's engineering degree meant nothing to potential employers who saw his Mexican education as somehow inferior to American credentials. So he worked 3 jobs: washing dishes at a downtown restaurant from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., doing construction work until 4 p.m., and attending night school to earn his American engineering certification from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. My mother, Isabella, cleaned offices in the financial district during the day, her literature degree reduced to wielding a mop and emptying trash cans. But every evening, she would sit in front of our old television, notebook in hand, watching the local news and writing down every English phrase she didn't recognize, determined to speak this language with the same eloquence she possessed in Spanish. I have vivid memories of watching her practice in the mirror, repeating the weather forecast until her pronunciation was perfect, rehearsing conversations she might have at parent-teacher conferences or grocery stores. She would quiz me on vocabulary words during dinner, turning our cramped apartment into a classroom where learning English became a family mission. Growing up bilingual in a border town, I learned early that my identity was beautifully complex, like a tapestry woven from 2 distinct but complementary threads. At home, we spoke Spanish with the melodic rhythm of Jalisco, told stories passed down through generations about brave women who crossed deserts and mountain ranges, and celebrated our rich cultural heritage with quinceañeras that lasted until dawn and Christmas traditions that stretched from December 16th through January 6th. Our house smelled like my grandmother's mole recipe and rang with the sound of Vicente Fernandez on weekend mornings. At school, I inhabited a different world entirely. I excelled in every subject, particularly in literature and communications, where I discovered that words had the power to build bridges between cultures, to translate not just language, but understanding. I devoured books in both English and Spanish, finding pieces of myself in the pages of authors who understood what it meant to live between worlds. By middle school, I was already writing essays that impressed my teachers and speeches that made my classmates cry. My high school years were a whirlwind of academic achievements and extracurricular leadership. I was editor of the school newspaper, captain of the debate team, and president of the student council. I organized cultural exchange programs that brought Mexican students to our school and created mentorship programs for younger Hispanic students who were struggling with the same identity questions I had faced. When I graduated as valedictorian, delivering my speech in both English and Spanish to a gymnasium packed with proud families, I felt like I had proven something important, that excellence knows no accent, no skin color, no border. Stanford University felt like stepping into a different universe. The campus was sprawling and beautiful, filled with students from every corner of the world, many of whom came from families where college was a given rather than a dream. But I thrived there, drawn to professors who challenged me to think bigger and classmates who pushed me to reach higher. I double majored in communications and business administration, writing my senior thesis on cultural intelligence in global business environments, a paper that would later be published in an academic journal and cited by dozens of other researchers. During my summers, I interned at Fortune 500 companies, technology startups, and nonprofit organizations, always eager to understand how different types of organizations functioned and where I might eventually make my mark. I noticed things that others seemed to miss, how certain voices were elevated while others were diminished, how meetings that could have benefited from diverse perspectives often became echo chambers, how brilliant ideas were sometimes dismissed, not because they lacked merit, but because they came from unexpected sources. After college, I spent 5 years working for Esperanza Educational Alliance, a nonprofit organization that helped underserved communities access educational resources. Those years shaped me in ways I couldn't have anticipated when I first walked into their modest offices in a converted warehouse on the east side of San Antonio. The organization was small but mighty, run by Dr. Carmen Gutierrez, a former teacher who had built the nonprofit from her kitchen table into a regional powerhouse that had helped over 10,000 students access higher education. My first project involved developing a communications strategy for a campaign to establish computer labs in rural schools throughout South Texas. I spent months driving to tiny towns where high school students had never touched a computer, where the nearest college was a 3-hour drive away, and where many families had never imagined their children pursuing education beyond graduation. I interviewed students who were brilliant but had no idea how to apply for college, parents who wanted to support their children but didn't understand the financial aid process, and teachers who were doing incredible work with virtually no resources. The campaign I developed told their stories in a way that resonated with donors, policymakers, and corporate sponsors. We raised $3.2 million in 6 months, establishing computer labs in 47 schools and creating scholarship programs that sent hundreds of students to college. But more than the numbers, what mattered to me was the thank you letter I received from a student named Roberto, who wrote, "Ms. Rodriguez, you helped me see that my dreams weren't too big for where I come from. They were just the right size for where I'm going." Over 5 years, I led campaigns that generated over $15 million in funding, established partnerships with major universities, and created programs that were eventually adopted by school districts across the Southwest. I developed bilingual materials that helped non-English speaking parents navigate complex educational systems, organized community forums where families could ask questions without fear of judgment, and trained counselors to recognize the unique challenges faced by first-generation college students. The work was fulfilling in ways that went beyond professional satisfaction. I was using my skills to open doors for kids who reminded me of myself, to ensure that talent wouldn't be wasted because of zip codes or accents or parents who didn't understand American educational bureaucracy. But as much as I loved the mission, I began to realize that systemic change required more than nonprofit advocacy. It required getting inside the systems themselves, influencing corporate policies, and demonstrating that diversity wasn't just morally right. It was economically smart. I dreamed of working for a major corporation where I could influence policy from the inside, where I could create programs that would open doors for people like me, people who had the talent and drive but needed someone to believe in them. I wanted to be in rooms where decisions were made, where I could ensure that voices like mine were heard not as tokens, but as leaders. That's how I found myself researching Morrison and Associates, one of the most prestigious consulting firms in Dallas. Their client list read like a who's who of American business: Fortune 100 companies, major government agencies, international nonprofits. They had helped reshape industries, guided companies through crises, and developed strategies that had created thousands of jobs. On their website, they boasted about their innovative approaches and fresh perspectives, language that made me believe they might genuinely value the different viewpoint I could bring. The senior communications director position seemed tailor-made for my background. They were looking for someone to lead their external communications, develop thought leadership content, and represent the company at industry conferences. The job description emphasized the need for cultural competency and ability to communicate with diverse stakeholder groups, phrases that made my heart race with excitement. On paper, I was the perfect candidate. I had the Stanford education that would impress their clients, 5 years of experience managing complex communications campaigns, and a portfolio of successful projects that had generated millions in funding for community programs. I spoke 3 languages fluently: English, Spanish, and Portuguese, which I had learned during a semester abroad in Brazil. I had connections throughout the Southwest, relationships built through years of community work and professional networking. Most importantly, I understood how to communicate with diverse audiences in ways that felt authentic rather than performative, something that was becoming increasingly valuable in the business world as companies scrambled to connect with changing demographics. I spent 3 weeks preparing for this interview with the intensity of a graduate student defending her dissertation. I researched every executive, reading their LinkedIn profiles, watching their conference presentations, and studying their backgrounds for common ground. I memorized their mission statement, their core values, and their recent press releases. I even found common connections through my Stanford alumni network, reaching out to former classmates who had worked with similar firms to get insider perspectives on what Morrison and Associates valued in their leadership. I bought a new suit, a sophisticated navy blue from a boutique downtown that specialized in professional women's clothing. The salesperson, an elegant woman in her 60s, helped me choose accessories that conveyed authority without being flashy. "You want them to remember your ideas, not your outfit," she said as she adjusted the jacket's shoulders. I felt confident and professional when I looked in the dressing room mirror, like someone who belonged in corner offices and boardrooms. I practiced my presentation until I could deliver it flawlessly, even incorporating recent data that showed how companies with diverse leadership teams consistently outperformed their competitors by 35% in profitability and 25% in innovation metrics. I prepared examples from my nonprofit work that demonstrated my ability to manage complex stakeholder relationships, handle crisis communications, and develop messaging that resonated across cultural and economic lines. I even rehearsed potential questions about my background, preparing responses that would highlight my unique perspective as an asset rather than a liability. The night before the interview, I called my parents to tell them about the opportunity. My father's voice swelled with pride as he said, "Maiha, this is why we came here, so you could have chances we never had." My mother reminded me to speak clearly and hold my head high. "You belong in that room," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I believed her. I believed in the American dream that had been passed down to me through generations of sacrifice and hope. I believed that my qualifications would speak for themselves, that my passion would shine through, and that this company would see the value I could bring to their organization. As I drove to their downtown office that crisp October morning, I felt nervous but excited. The building was a testament to success, 30 floors of gleaming glass and steel reaching toward the sky. In the lobby, I admired the modern art and the impeccably dressed professionals hurrying to their meetings. This was where I belonged, I told myself. This was the next step in my journey. I arrived 15 minutes early, as my father had always taught me. Punctuality shows respect, he would say. I checked my appearance one last time in the lobby restroom, smoothed my hair, and practiced my smile. I had prepared for every possible question, every scenario I could imagine. I was ready. The Morrison and Associates building dominated the Dallas skyline like a monument to corporate success. 30 floors of gleaming glass and steel that caught the morning sun and threw it back in brilliant fragments. As I pulled into the parking garage, I felt the familiar flutter of pre-interview nerves mixed with genuine excitement. This was it, the opportunity I had been preparing for my entire career. The receptionist, a young blonde woman with perfectly manicured nails and a smile that seemed surgically attached to her face, looked up from her computer with a puzzled expression when I approached her marble desk. Her nameplate read Madison in elegant script, and everything about her, from her pearl earrings to her crisp white blouse, screamed old money and East Coast privilege. "Good morning," I said with my most professional smile, my voice carrying the slight musical quality that came from growing up speaking both English and Spanish. "I'm Elena Rodriguez. I have a 10 o'clock interview with Mr. Morrison and the executive team." Madison blinked slowly, as if my words were coming to her through water. "Oh," she said, her tone shifting from professional courtesy to something I couldn't quite identify. "You're Elena? I was expecting someone different." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I felt a small knot form in my stomach, the same feeling I used to get in elementary school when substitute teachers would struggle to pronounce my name, turning it into something foreign and uncomfortable in their mouths. "Yes, that's me," I replied, maintaining my smile even as I felt my confidence waver slightly. "Should I have a seat?" "Sure," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the waiting area with a wave that suggested I was now someone else's problem. "They'll be with you shortly." The waiting area was designed to intimidate. Leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Coffee table books about art and architecture. Fresh orchids that probably had their own maintenance staff. I chose a chair that faced away from Madison's desk and tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that something was already going wrong. I reviewed my notes one more time, straightened my blazer, and reminded myself that I belonged here. 10 o'clock came and went. Then 10:15, 10:30. I watched other people arrive for meetings, men in expensive suits who were immediately escorted upstairs, women with designer handbags who barely had to state their names before being whisked away. Each time someone was taken up immediately while I continued to wait, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. At 10:45, I approached Madison's desk again. "Excuse me," I said politely. "I just wanted to confirm that Mr. Morrison's team knows I'm here." My appointment was for 10 o'clock. Madison looked at me with barely concealed annoyance, as if my presence was somehow disrupting her perfectly organized morning. "They know you're here," she said, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there during my first interaction. "They're running behind schedule. These things happen." "Of course," I replied. though inside I was wondering if these things happened to everyone or just to people who looked like me. Finally, at 10:50, a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit emerged from the elevator bank. He moved with the confident swagger of someone who had never doubted his place in the world, never questioned whether he belonged in rooms like this. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his tie was silk, and his shoes probably cost more than I had spent on my entire interview outfit. "Elena Rodriguez?" he called out, pronouncing my name like it was a foreign phrase he was attempting for the first time. Each syllable carefully enunciated, as if he were speaking to someone who might not understand English. "Yes, that's me." I stood up, extending my hand for what I hoped would be a firm, professional handshake. "I'm James Morrison, CEO," he said, barely touching my hand before pulling away, as if physical contact was somehow distasteful. His handshake was limp and dismissive, the kind reserved for people you have to acknowledge but don't actually want to engage with. "Follow me." In the elevator, the silence was thick and uncomfortable. The mirrored walls reflected our images back infinitely. His tall, confident frame next to my more petite stature, his pale skin contrasting with my olive complexion, his obvious comfort in this environment versus my growing unease. I attempted to break the tension with small talk. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Morrison," I said, injecting as much enthusiasm as I could muster into my voice. "I'm really excited to discuss how I can contribute to your team's success and help Morrison and Associates reach new markets." He glanced at me sideways, his expression suggesting that my excitement was somehow inappropriate or presumptuous. Was all he said, followed by the mechanical ding of floors passing by. The conference room was designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. A long mahogany table that could seat 20 people, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most cars. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of downtown Dallas, making everyone in the room feel like masters of the universe. The walls were decorated with awards, framed articles from business magazines, and photographs of Mr. Morrison shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. 3 other executives were already seated when we entered, arranged along one side of the table like judges at a tribunal. There was Sarah Mitchell, their current communications VP, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to catalog everything without revealing anything. Next to her sat David Wellington, the CFO, whose expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, and Robert Chen, their director of strategic planning, who was openly scrolling through his phone as if my presence wasn't worth his attention. "Please have a seat," Mr. Morrison said, gesturing to the chair at the far end of the table. The positioning was clearly intentional, isolating me from the group, making me feel like an outsider looking in rather than a potential colleague. I settled into the chair and pulled out my presentation materials, trying to project confidence despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere. "Thank you all for taking the time to meet with me today," I began, making eye contact with each person around the table. "I'm excited to share my vision for how Morrison and Associates can expand its reach and strengthen its communication strategies." I launched into my presentation with the confidence that had served me well throughout my career. I explained my vision for modernizing their communication strategy, reaching untapped markets in the Southwest, where Hispanic populations were driving economic growth, and developing thought leadership content that would position Morrison and Associates as forward-thinking leaders in an increasingly diverse business landscape. But I could feel their attention drifting almost immediately. Sarah Mitchell kept checking her phone, making no effort to hide her disinterest. David Wellington was openly reviewing what appeared to be financial reports. Robert Chen had moved from scrolling through his phone to actually typing emails. Only Mr. Morrison was looking at me, but his expression suggested he was evaluating something entirely different from my professional qualifications. "Can you repeat that last part?" Mr. Morrison interrupted me mid-sentence, even though I had been speaking clearly and at a measured pace. "Your accent is quite thick. We need someone who can communicate effectively with our clients." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs and making my cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. I had lived in Texas my entire life. I had given presentations to university boards, government officials, and corporate executives throughout my career. I had been praised for my communication skills by professors, supervisors, and colleagues. Never once, not even during my most challenging presentations, had anyone suggested that my accent was a barrier to communication. "Of course," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady even as my heart pounded with humiliation. I repeated my point about expanding their client base in the Southwest, where Spanish-speaking markets were experiencing explosive growth and where cultural competency was becoming a competitive advantage rather than a nice-to-have. "Yes, well," Sarah Mitchell finally looked up from her phone, her expression suggesting that my words were somehow personally offensive to her. "We're not really looking to cater to those kinds of clients. Our brand is built on a certain level of sophistication, and we've worked very hard to establish our reputation with a particular clientele." The implication hung in the air like poison gas, invisible but deadly. I felt my cheeks burn with a combination of embarrassment and rage, but I continued with my presentation, determined to show them the data that proved how wrong they were. I pulled up statistics about Latino purchasing power, over $2.3 trillion annually and growing. I showed them demographics about the fastest-growing markets in Texas, about companies that had doubled their revenue by embracing cultural diversity, about the competitive advantages that came from understanding multicultural audiences. But I could see it in their faces, the polite disinterest, the sideways glances, the barely concealed impatience. They had already made up their minds about me, and it had nothing to do with my qualifications, my experience, or my ideas. I wasn't what they had expected when they saw my name on paper, and I wasn't what they wanted representing their company. "Do you think you'd be comfortable representing our company at high-level client meetings?" David Wellington asked, finally looking up from his financial reports. His tone was dripping with condescension, the kind reserved for people you're trying to politely dismiss. "Some of our clients are very traditional in their expectations." The question felt like a trap, designed to make me second-guess my own abilities. "I've successfully managed client relationships worth over $50 million, I replied, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me like a storm. "I can provide references from Fortune 500 executives, university presidents, and government officials who have worked with me extensively. In fact, many of them specifically sought me out because of my ability to communicate across cultural lines." Robert Chen finally looked up from his phone, wearing the expression of someone who had just heard something mildly amusing. "That's interesting," he said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "But our clients expect a certain polish, a level of sophistication that might be challenging for someone with your background." There it was, the coded language that everyone in the room understood but no one would acknowledge. My background, not my education from Stanford, not my 5 years of professional experience, not my proven track record of success. My background, the color of my skin, the sound of my voice, the Hispanic surname that had apparently set off alarm bells the moment they saw it on my resume. I took a deep breath and tried one more time to redirect the conversation to my qualifications. I understand the importance of client relationships, I said, pulling up a slide that showed testimonials from my previous work. Dr. Patricia Valdez, who sits on 3 Fortune 500 boards, wrote in her recommendation letter that I have exceptional ability to communicate complex ideas with clarity and cultural sensitivity. Senator Maria Gonzalez specifically requested that I lead the communications for her education initiative because of what she called my unique ability to bridge different worlds. Sarah Mitchell leaned back in her chair with a smirk that made my skin crawl. Yes, well, I'm sure you're very effective with your community. But Morrison and Associates serves a different caliber of client. We work with CEOs, government officials, international leaders. They expect a certain aesthetic. The word aesthetic hit me like a slap. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. This wasn't about my qualifications, my experience, or my communication skills. This was about whether I looked the part they wanted to present to their clients. This was about whether my face, my voice, my very presence aligned with their narrow definition of what professionalism looked like. I see, I said quietly, gathering my presentation materials with hands that I willed not to shake. And what aesthetic are you looking for exactly? The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by something outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. David Wellington returned to his financial reports as if I had suddenly become invisible. Robert Chen picked up his phone again, thumb scrolling with practiced indifference. Only Sarah Mitchell met my eyes, and what I saw there was a cold satisfaction, as if she was pleased that I finally understood my place. We're looking for someone who fits our corporate culture, she said, with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Someone who can represent our brand without complications. They exchanged glances that spoke volumes, the kind of silent communication that happens between people who share the same assumptions about the world and everyone's place in it. In that moment, I realized that nothing I could say would matter. They hadn't brought me here to evaluate my qualifications. They had brought me here to check a box, to say they had interviewed a diverse candidate. The decision had been made the moment I walked through their door, maybe even the moment they saw my name on my resume. Well, Mr. Morrison said, standing up abruptly and glancing at his expensive watch. We appreciate you coming in. We'll be in touch. The interview that was supposed to last an hour had been cut short after 25 minutes. As I gathered my materials, trying to maintain whatever dignity I had left, I heard Sarah Mitchell lean over to David Wellington and whisper something that made him chuckle. They weren't even trying to hide their dismissal anymore. Thank you for your time, I said, standing and extending my hand to Mr. Morrison one final time. This time he shook it properly, but his grip was cold and perfunctory, like he was completing an unpleasant obligation. Walking back through that marble lobby, past Madison the receptionist, who suddenly found her computer screen fascinating, I felt a humiliation deeper than anything I had ever experienced. It was different from not getting a job because of lack of experience or poor qualifications. This was being rejected for who I was at my core, for the accent that carried the music of my heritage, for the skin that connected me to generations of strong women, for the name that honored my grandfather who had died fighting for justice in Mexico. In the elevator, alone with my reflection in the polished steel doors, I saw something I had never seen before. myself through their eyes. Not as Elena Rodriguez, Stanford graduate. Not as Elena Rodriguez, successful professional with 5 years of proven results. Not as Elena Rodriguez, bilingual communicator who could reach markets they had never even considered. Just as someone who didn't belong in their world, someone whose very presence somehow diminished their carefully cultivated image. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 30 minutes, too stunned to start the engine. The leather seats of my Honda Civic suddenly felt shabby compared to the opulence I had just left behind. My navy suit, which had made me feel so confident that morning, now felt like a costume I had worn to a party where I was never truly invited. This wasn't the first time I had encountered prejudice in my life, but it was the first time it had been so blatant, yet so carefully wrapped in corporate language. It was the first time I had been dismissed, not despite my qualifications, but because of who I was. It was the first time I had been made to feel that my accent, this beautiful blend of 2 languages, 2 cultures, 2 histories, was something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. As I finally started my car and pulled out of that parking garage, I felt something shifting inside me. The humiliation was still there, raw and painful, but underneath it, something else was growing, a quiet rage that had nothing to do with personal slights and everything to do with systemic injustice. The rejection email arrived 3 days later, delivered to my inbox at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, like corporate bad news often is. Time to ruin your weekend, but late enough that there's no one available to discuss it. It was brief, impersonal, and insulting in its generic nature. Dear Ms. Rodriguez, thank you for your interest in Morrison & Associates and for taking the time to interview with our team. While your background is impressive, we have decided to move forward with a candidate who is a better fit for our organizational culture and client expectations. We appreciate your interest in our company and wish you the best in your future endeavors. Sincerely, Morrison & Associates Human Resources Team. A better fit for their organizational culture. The words echoed in my mind as I stared at the email on my laptop screen, reading it over and over as if the words might change if I looked at them long enough. I knew exactly what that meant, and it had nothing to do with my qualifications, my experience, or my ability to do the job they had posted. That night, I called my best friend Maria, who worked in HR for a major tech company in Austin. Maria and I had met during our freshman year at Stanford, bonding over late-night study sessions and the shared experience of being first-generation college students, navigating a world our parents couldn't fully understand. She had always been my sounding board, the person who could help me see situations clearly when my emotions clouded my judgment. I told her everything that had happened, every detail, every subtle slight, every obvious dismissal. I described the way Mr. Morrison had pronounced my name, the way Sarah Mitchell had checked her phone throughout my presentation, the way they had questioned my ability to represent their sophisticated brand. Elena, Maria said when I finished, her voice tight with anger. You know this wasn't about your qualifications, right? This was discrimination, plain and simple. But how do I prove that? I asked, feeling exhausted and defeated. They never said anything explicitly. They were too smart for that. They used all the right corporate language. That's exactly how modern discrimination works, Maria explained, her voice rising with frustration. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's the cultural fit excuse. It's the assumption that your accent makes you less professional. It's the surprise that you're not what they expected when they saw your name on paper. It's coded language that everyone understands, but no one will admit to using. She was right, and I knew it. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things. The seed of doubt they had planted was growing, spreading through my confidence like a virus. Over the next few weeks, I found myself questioning everything I had believed about my place in the professional world. Had I been naive to think that my accomplishments would speak for themselves? Had I been living in a bubble, protected by the diversity of my nonprofit work and the liberal environment of my university? I started paying attention to things I had never noticed before, or rather, things I had noticed but had trained myself to overlook. I watched job postings more carefully, noting which companies emphasized cultural fit over qualifications, which used phrases like polished communication skills and executive presence, code words that seemed designed to exclude people like me. I researched Morrison and Associates more thoroughly and discovered that their executive team was entirely white. Their board of directors was entirely male, and their diversity initiatives consisted of a single paragraph on their website about respecting all backgrounds, the kind of meaningless corporate speak that said everything and nothing at once. I found myself scrolling through their social media accounts, looking at photos from company events and client meetings. Every face was the same: white, privileged, comfortable in their shared assumption about what success looked like. There were no Elenas, no Marias, no Robertos. There was no one who looked like they had fought for their place at the table. No one whose parents had cleaned offices to pay for their education. No one whose accent carried the music of another language. But what bothered me most was the seed of doubt they had planted about myself. I found myself practicing my pronunciation in the mirror, trying to flatten the natural rhythm of my speech that came from growing up bilingual. I considered shortening my name to Lena on my resume, thinking it might help me get past whatever assumptions hiring managers made when they saw Elena Rodriguez. I even wondered if I should leave off my volunteer work with Latino community organizations, worried that it might mark me as someone who was too ethnic for corporate America. The self-doubt was insidious, creeping into every aspect of my job search. When I prepared for other interviews, I found myself second-guessing word choices, wondering if my enthusiasm came across as unprofessional, if my passion for diversity and inclusion made me seem like a troublemaker. I started censoring myself in ways I never had before, trying to be more neutral, more safe, more like what I thought they wanted me to be. 3 weeks after the Morrison interview, I was having coffee with Dr. Patricia Valdez, my former professor and mentor from Stanford. Dr. Valdez was a legend in the communications field, a first-generation Mexican-American woman who had built several successful companies, served on multiple corporate boards, and was frequently quoted in business publications. She was everything I aspired to be, and she had achieved it all while never hiding who she was or where she came from. "Elena," she said, stirring her coffee and studying my face with the same intensity she had once brought to analyzing case studies. "You seem different. What's troubling you?" I told her about Morrison and Associates, about the interview, about the rejection, and about how it had shaken my confidence in ways I was still trying to understand. I admitted that I had been questioning whether I was being too sensitive, whether maybe they were right that I wasn't the right fit for certain environments. Dr. Valdez listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window of the coffee shop at the busy street beyond. "Let me tell you something," she finally said, turning back to me with eyes that blazed with an intensity I had seen only a few times before. 30 years ago, when I was starting my career, a hiring manager told me that I was too ethnic for client-facing roles. He suggested I might be happier in back-office operations, where my accent wouldn't be an issue. "What did you do?" I asked. "I thanked him for his time, walked out of that office, and started my own company," she said with a smile that was both warm and fierce. "Within 5 years, I was competing directly against his firm. Within 10 years, I had bought his company and made him report to me." I laughed despite myself, imagining that conversation. "But here's what I learned," she continued, her voice becoming more serious. "The moment you start changing who you are to fit their narrow definition of acceptability, you've already lost. Not just the job, you've lost yourself. And once you lose yourself, everything else becomes meaningless." Her words hit me like a revelation. I realized that I had been so focused on trying to fit into their world that I had forgotten why I wanted to be there in the first place. I hadn't wanted to join Morrison and Associates to become like them. I had wanted to join them to change them, to bring a different perspective, to help them see the value of diversity not as a checkbox, but as a competitive advantage. That evening, I called my parents to tell them about my struggles with the job search, though I didn't mention the specific details of the Morrison interview. I wasn't ready to tell them how their daughter, their source of pride, their proof that the American dream was real, had been made to feel unwelcome in the very spaces she had worked so hard to reach. "¿Cómo va la búsqueda de trabajo, mija?" my father asked in Spanish, his voice warm with concern. "It's challenging, Papa," I admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm aiming too high, if maybe I should settle for something more realistic." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When my father spoke again, his voice carried an edge I had rarely heard before. "When I first came to this country," he said, switching to English in the deliberate way he did when he wanted to make sure I understood not just his words, but their full meaning. "People told me my engineering degree from Mexico wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. They said I should be grateful for any job, even if it meant starting over completely. Do you know what I did?" I had heard this story before, but never in this context. "You got certified here," I said. "You took every exam they required. That's right. But do you know why? Not because I believed they were right about my education being worthless. I knew my education was excellent. Mexico has some of the finest engineering programs in the world. I did it because I understood that sometimes you have to prove yourself according to their rules before you can change the game entirely. But it's different now, Papa," I said. "It's not as obvious as it used to be. People don't say things directly anymore." "Mija," my mother's voice came through the phone. She had been listening on the extension. "That makes it more dangerous, not less. When racism hides behind politeness and professionalism, people think it doesn't exist anymore. But it does. And the only way to fight it is to shine so bright that they can't ignore you. So bright that their excuses become obviously false." "But what if I'm not bright enough?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing inside me since that day in the Morrison conference room. "You are the daughter of parents who crossed borders for your dreams," my father said, his voice rising with emotion. "You are the granddaughter of women who fought revolutions and men who built railroads. You have Stanford degrees and 5 years of proven success. If you're not bright enough, then their definition of bright is broken." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about Morrison and Associates, about the way they had dismissed me, about the narrow world they had built for themselves. I thought about all the talented professionals they were missing out on because of their limited definition of what success looked like. And then I started thinking about all the other companies that probably operated the same way. How many qualified candidates were being dismissed before they even got a chance to prove themselves? How many organizations were limiting their own potential because they couldn't see past their preconceptions? How many bright, talented, driven people were being told they weren't the right fit because they didn't look or sound like what success was supposed to look like? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just angry for myself, but angry for every person who had been made to feel like they didn't belong, every dreamer who had been told they weren't the right fit, every professional who had been asked to make themselves smaller to make others comfortable. By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to shrink away from this experience. I wasn't going to let Morrison and Associates make me doubt myself or change who I was. I was going to use their rejection as fuel, their discrimination as motivation. I was going to prove them wrong, but not by becoming what they wanted me to be. I was going to prove them wrong by being exactly who I was, brilliantly and unapologetically. 3 weeks after the Morrison and Associates interview, I was sitting in Café Cultura, a small coffee shop near the University District that served the best café con leche in the city and displayed artwork from local Latino artists on its walls. I was having my monthly mentoring coffee with Dr. Patricia Valdez, a tradition we had maintained since I graduated from Stanford 5 years earlier. Dr. Valdez was more than just a former professor. She was a legend in the communications field, a first-generation Mexican-American woman who had shattered every glass ceiling she encountered. She had built 3 successful companies, served on the boards of major corporations, and was frequently quoted in Harvard Business Review and Fortune magazine. More importantly, she had done it all while never hiding who she was or where she came from. "Elena," she said, stirring her coffee and studying my face with the same analytical intensity she had once brought to deconstructing case studies. "You seem different today. What's troubling you?" I had been dreading this conversation, knowing that Dr. Valdez would see right through any attempt to downplay what had happened. I told her about Morrison and Associates, about the interview, the subtle comments, the obvious dismissal, and the polite rejection that followed. I admitted that the experience had shaken my confidence in ways I was still trying to understand. "I keep wondering if I'm being too sensitive," I confessed, wrapping my hands around my coffee cup for warmth. Maybe they were right that I wasn't the right fit. Maybe I need to be more realistic about what kinds of opportunities are actually available to people like me. Dr. Valdez listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the street where students hurried between classes, all of them carrying dreams that seemed more achievable than mine felt at that moment. "Elena," she finally said, turning back to me with eyes that blazed with an intensity I had seen only a few times before. "I want to tell you something that might change your perspective on this whole situation." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her news apps with practiced efficiency. "Have you been following the Morrison and Associates scandal?" I looked at her blankly. "What scandal?" She found what she was looking for and turned her phone toward me. The headline made my heart stop. "Major Dallas consulting firm under federal investigation for systematic discriminatory practices." My hands trembled slightly as I took her phone and began reading. Morrison and Associates was being investigated by the Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs after multiple complaints from former employees and job candidates. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of discrimination against minorities, women, non-native English speakers, and anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of cultural fit. "This has been building for years," Dr. Valdez explained as I continued reading, my eyes wide with disbelief. Your experience isn't isolated, Elena. There are dozens of others who have come forward with similar stories. The pattern is so clear that the DOL had no choice but to open a formal investigation. As I scrolled through the article, I saw quotes that could have come from my own experience. A Latina software engineer who was told she might be more comfortable in a back-office role despite having an MIT degree. An Asian American consultant who was repeatedly asked to slow down during presentations even though English was his first language. A Black marketing executive who was told that her urban background might not resonate with their traditional clients. "Look at this," Dr. Valdez said, pointing to a section of the article. They're facing potential lawsuits from 17 different plaintiffs, government sanctions that could cost them millions, and a public relations nightmare that's already caused 3 major clients to terminate their contracts. I felt a mix of vindication and anger as I read about other people who had experienced the same subtle racism I had encountered. At least I wasn't crazy. At least I hadn't imagined the discrimination. But I was also furious that this had been going on for years, that Morrison and Associates had been systematically excluding qualified candidates based on prejudice rather than performance. But here's the really interesting part, Dr. Valdez continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when she was about to reveal a particularly important insight. The Department of Labor is looking for someone to lead their new Diversity and Inclusion Compliance Division here in the Southwest region. Someone with corporate experience, communications expertise, and a deep personal understanding of discrimination issues. She reached into her purse and pulled out a printed job description, placing it on the table between us. I scanned it quickly, my excitement building with each line. The position involved investigating companies for discriminatory practices, developing compliance programs, working with federal attorneys on enforcement actions, and ensuring that equal opportunity laws were being followed. The salary was nearly double what Morrison and Associates had been offering, and the opportunity to create real, systemic change was exactly what I had always dreamed of doing. "Dr. Valdez," I said slowly, looking up from the job description. "Why are you showing me this?" She smiled with the satisfaction of a chess player who had just revealed a winning strategy. "Because I've already recommended you for the position. The regional director is Jennifer Chen, a former student of mine who graduated 3 years before you did." When she described what they were looking for, someone with communications expertise, proven track record of working with diverse communities, and personal experience with workplace discrimination, I immediately thought of you. I stared at her in amazement. "You recommended me? For a federal position?" "Elena, you have an interview next Thursday," she said, pulling out another piece of paper. "Jennifer specifically requested that you apply after I told her about your background and your recent experience with certain consulting firms." The irony was almost too perfect to believe. While Morrison and Associates was fighting for their reputation and potentially facing millions in fines, I was being offered the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to ensure that other companies never got away with what they had done to me. Over the next few days, I threw myself into preparing for the DOL interview with the same intensity I had brought to preparing for Morrison and Associates. But this time felt completely different. I wasn't trying to convince them that I could fit into their culture. I was demonstrating how my unique perspective and experiences could help them fulfill their mission of ensuring equal opportunity in American workplaces. The Department of Labor offices were a stark contrast to Morrison and Associates' gleaming corporate headquarters. The building was government-issued functional rather than architecturally impressive. But the moment I walked through the doors, I felt something I had never experienced at Morrison, a sense of belonging. The walls were lined with posters in multiple languages about workers' rights. The staff was visibly diverse, and the mission statement prominently displayed in the lobby spoke about dignity, fairness, and opportunity for all workers. Jennifer Chen met me in the lobby personally, something that would never have happened at Morrison and Associates. She was a petite woman with a warm smile and a firm handshake, wearing a professional but unpretentious suit that suggested competence without ostentation. "Elena," she said, as she led me to the conference room, "Dr. Valdez has told me incredible things about you. We're thrilled that you're interested in joining our team." The interview was like nothing I had ever experienced. Instead of questioning whether I could represent their organization, they wanted to understand how my experiences could strengthen their mission. Instead of suggesting that my background was a liability, they saw it as an asset. They asked thoughtful questions about my nonprofit work, my community connections, and my ideas for improving their outreach to underserved populations. "We need someone who doesn't just understand discrimination intellectually," Jennifer explained, "but someone who has lived it, who understands the subtle ways it manifests in modern workplaces, and who has the communication skills to help us explain these issues to companies that might not want to hear the truth." When they offered me the position at the end of the interview, I accepted immediately. But the best part came a few days later when Maria called me, barely able to contain her excitement. "Elena, you're not going to believe this," she said, her voice practically vibrating with glee. "I just got off the phone with my contact in Dallas. Morrison and Associates is in full panic mode." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I could already guess where this was going. "The DOL investigation has scared off half their clients," she explained. "Companies are afraid to be associated with them while they're under federal scrutiny. Their stock price has dropped 20%, and they're scrambling to rebuild their reputation before the investigation concludes." I waited for the other shoe to drop. "They want you back, Elena. They're offering you the communications director position, the same one they rejected you for, plus a $30,000 signing bonus. They want you to help them develop their diversity initiatives and manage their crisis communications." I sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing the cosmic irony of the situation. 3 weeks ago, they had dismissed me as unsuitable for their sophisticated brand. Now they wanted me to save their company from the consequences of their own prejudice. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "I told them I'd pass along the message," Maria said. "But Elena, you should know. They have no idea you're starting at the DOL next week. They think you're unemployed and desperate." That evening, I sat down at my computer and crafted my response to Morrison and Associates. I wrote and rewrote it several times, trying to find the perfect balance between professionalism and the satisfaction I felt at being able to reject them the way they had rejected me. The final version was brief, professional, and absolutely devastating. "Dear Mr. Morrison, thank you for your recent offer regarding the communications director position at Morrison and Associates. While I appreciate your newfound interest in my qualifications, I must respectfully decline. As of Monday, I will be starting my new position as Regional Director of the Department of Labor's Diversity and Inclusion Compliance Division for the Southwest region. In this role, I will be overseeing federal investigations into discriminatory hiring practices at consulting firms throughout Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. I look forward to working with your company in my new capacity to ensure that all candidates are evaluated based on their qualifications rather than their accent, appearance, or perceived cultural fit. I believe this collaboration will be mutually beneficial as Morrison and Associates works to address the concerns raised in the current federal investigation. Should you need to reach me regarding compliance matters, Please contact my office through the Department of Labor's main number. All communications regarding ongoing investigations will need to be coordinated through our legal department. Sincerely, Elena Rodriguez, Regional Director, DOL Diversity and Inclusion Compliance Division, United States Department of Labor. I read it one more time, making sure every word was perfect, then hit send. Immediately, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The weight of their rejection, their judgment, their narrow definition of who belonged in their world. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. It was my father. "Mija," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother just told me about your new job. I am so proud of you I can barely speak." "Thank you, Papa," I said, feeling tears prick at my eyes. "You know what this means, don't you?" he continued. "You're not just proving them wrong. You're making sure they can never be wrong in the same way again." My first day at the Department of Labor felt like coming home to a place I had never been before. The office was diverse in every sense of the word. People of all backgrounds, ages, experiences, and perspectives working together toward a common goal that actually mattered. Unlike the sterile corporate environment of Morrison and Associates, this felt like a place where different voices were not just tolerated, but valued, where my accent and perspective weren't liabilities to be managed, but assets to be leveraged. Jennifer Chen greeted me that first Monday morning with a firm handshake and genuine enthusiasm that was completely different from the performative politeness I had encountered in corporate America. "Elena," she said, walking me through offices where I could hear conversations in Spanish, Mandarin, and Vietnamese alongside English. "Dr. Valdez has told me incredible things about you, but more importantly, your experience with discriminatory hiring practices gives you insights that our team desperately needs. We're thrilled to have someone with your background leading our Southwest Division." "Thank you," I replied, feeling a warmth and belonging that I hadn't experienced since my days at the nonprofit. "I'm excited to get started." "Good," she said with a smile that suggested she understood exactly what I was feeling. "Because your first major case is going to be a significant one. We need someone to personally oversee the Morrison and Associates investigation. Given your background in communications and your familiarity with their practices, you're the perfect person to lead this effort. Are you comfortable with that?" I thought about the moment I had sat in my car after that humiliating interview, feeling small and defeated. I thought about all the other candidates who had been dismissed before they could even prove themselves, all the talented professionals who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. I thought about my parents, who had sacrificed everything so I could have opportunities they never had. "More than comfortable," I said, feeling a surge of purpose that I had never experienced before. "I'm ready." The Morrison and Associates investigation became my primary focus over the next several months, and what we uncovered was even worse than the initial complaints had suggested. Working with a team of federal investigators, employment lawyers, and data analysts, we discovered a systematic pattern of discrimination that went back over a decade. The evidence was overwhelming. Email chains where hiring managers discussed candidates' ethnic-sounding names and whether they would fit in with clients. Interview notes that included inappropriate comments about accents, appearances, and cultural backgrounds. Salary data that showed significant pay gaps between white employees and employees of color, even when controlling for experience and education. Performance reviews that consistently rated minority employees lower on subjective measures like executive presence and cultural fit, while rating them equally or higher on objective measures like results and technical skills. Perhaps most damning was a series of internal memos from Sarah Mitchell's department that explicitly discussed maintaining their brand image by hiring candidates who would appeal to their traditional client base. One memo, written just 2 months before my interview, stated, "We need to be strategic about diversity hiring. We can interview diverse candidates to show compliance, but we should focus on those who will blend seamlessly with our existing culture." The investigation took 8 months to complete, during which Morrison and Associates fought us every step of the way. They hired expensive lawyers who tried to discredit our findings, attempted to claim that their hiring decisions were based on legitimate business factors, and even suggested that the complainants were simply not qualified for the positions they had sought. But the evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious, and our case too strong. In the end, Morrison and Associates agreed to a settlement that included a $3.2 million penalty, mandatory bias training for all employees, a complete restructuring of their hiring practices, and ongoing federal monitoring of their employment decisions for the next 5 years. More importantly, the case became a watershed moment for the entire industry. Other consulting firms, terrified of facing similar investigations, proactively began revising their hiring practices. The cultural fit excuse was finally being recognized for what it really was: a polite way of maintaining the status quo and excluding qualified candidates who didn't fit narrow demographic expectations. 6 months after the settlement was announced, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the University of Texas Annual Diversity and Inclusion Conference. Standing behind the podium in the packed auditorium, looking out at an audience of professors, students, business leaders, and activists, I felt the weight of responsibility for all the people who had been dismissed, overlooked, and undervalued because of who they were rather than what they could contribute. Discrimination today rarely looks like a sign that says "no dogs or Mexicans," I told the crowd, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium without any doubt about my ability to communicate effectively. It looks like a hiring manager who decides you're not a cultural fit before you finish introducing yourself. It sounds like someone asking you to repeat yourself because your accent is thick, even though you're speaking the same language they are. It feels like being made to believe that your heritage is something to overcome rather than something to celebrate. The applause was thunderous, but I wasn't finished. But here's what I learned from my experience. They can question your accent, but they can't question your accomplishments. They can doubt your fit, but they can't deny your qualifications. They can underestimate your potential, but they can't stop your progress, especially when the federal government is watching to make sure they follow the law. In the back of the auditorium, I spotted a familiar face. It was Sarah Mitchell from Morrison and Associates, looking uncomfortable and shifting in her seat as I spoke about accountability and systemic change. She was probably there because the settlement agreement required Morrison executives to attend diversity training sessions, and this conference qualified as continuing education. After my speech, during the reception, where attendees networked over wine and appetizers, she approached me. I could see the internal struggle on her face, the desire to avoid this conversation warring with the knowledge that she probably needed to make some gesture of reconciliation. "Ms. Rodriguez," she said, extending her hand with obvious reluctance. "Congratulations on your success. I hope there are no hard feelings about before." I looked at her for a long moment, remembering how she had checked her phone during my presentation, how she had whispered and laughed with her colleague, how she had suggested that my background made me unsuitable for their sophisticated clients. "Ms. Mitchell," I said, taking her hand in a firm grip and meeting her eyes directly, "there are no hard feelings, but there are consequences, Your company paid a $3.2 million settlement, implemented mandatory bias training, restructured your entire hiring process, and is under federal monitoring for the next 5 years. That's not personal. That's progress. She nodded awkwardly, mumbled something about how they were committed to doing better, and quickly excused herself to find someone else to talk to. Later that evening, I called my parents to tell them about the speech and the encounter with Sarah Mitchell. My father answered the phone, and I could hear my mother listening on the extension. "Mija," my father said, his voice thick with emotion and pride. "Do you remember what I told you about proving them wrong?" "I remember, Papa," I said. "You didn't just prove them wrong," he continued, his voice rising with the satisfaction of a man who had lived to see his daughter exceed his wildest dreams. "You proved that their wrong was so wrong that the government had to step in and fix it. You didn't just get justice for yourself, you got justice for everyone who comes after you." We all laughed at that, but there was profound truth in his words. The Morrison and Associates case had become a landmark investigation that led to policy changes throughout the consulting industry and beyond. Companies across the country were revising their hiring practices, and the cultural fit excuse was finally being recognized for what it really was, a euphemism for discrimination. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome came a year later, when I received a LinkedIn message from a young woman named Isabella Morales, a recent graduate from UT Austin's business school. "Ms. Rodriguez," she wrote, "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. I just got hired as a senior financial analyst at Morrison and Associates." Yes, the same Morrison and Associates. During my interview process, they specifically mentioned their commitment to diversity and inclusion, and they actually seemed excited about my bilingual skills and multicultural background. The hiring manager told me that they've learned that diverse perspectives make their work stronger and their recommendations more comprehensive. "I know that wouldn't have been possible without the work you did. You didn't just change one company, you changed an entire industry for people like us." That message meant more to me than any award, recognition, or salary increase I could have received. Because ultimately, this wasn't about my personal vindication, though that felt good too. It was about ensuring that the next Isabella Morales wouldn't have to experience what I had experienced. It was about creating a world where talent was recognized, regardless of how it sounded, what it looked like, or where it came from. 2 years after starting at the Department of Labor, I was promoted to National Director of Diversity and Inclusion Compliance, overseeing investigations and enforcement actions across the entire country. My team had grown from just me to over 50 investigators, lawyers, and compliance specialists, and we were handling cases involving some of the largest corporations in America. The work was challenging, sometimes frustrating, and always important. We were literally changing the landscape of American employment, one investigation at a time, one settlement at a time, one company at a time. We were ensuring that the promise of equal opportunity wasn't just a nice phrase in employee handbooks, but a lived reality for millions of workers. And sometimes, late at night when I was reviewing case files or preparing for testimony, I would think about that conference room at Morrison and Associates. I would remember the dismissive looks, the coded language, the assumptions about what I was capable of based on how I sounded rather than what I had accomplished. They had been so wrong about me that their wrongness had become my career. As I sit here today, 5 years after that humiliating interview at Morrison and Associates, writing this story from my office in Washington, D.C., where I now serve as National Director of Diversity and Inclusion Compliance, I think about the extraordinary journey that brought me to this point. That conference room where I was made to feel small and unwelcome was supposed to be the end of my corporate dreams. Instead, it became the catalyst for the most meaningful work of my life. I learned that discrimination in the 21st century rarely announces itself with bold declarations or obvious slights. Instead, it whispers in the language of cultural fit and executive presence. It hides behind phrases like, "We need someone who can communicate effectively with our clients," and "they expect a certain level of sophistication." It masks itself as professional standards, while systematically excluding anyone who doesn't fit a narrow, outdated definition of what success is supposed to look like. But I also learned something far more important. When you shine bright enough, when you stand tall enough, when you speak truth loudly enough, even the most entrenched systems have no choice but to change. The very discrimination that was meant to silence me became the foundation for work that has helped thousands of other professionals find their voices. My accent, that beautiful blend of Texas drawl and Mexican melody, of English precision and Spanish poetry, isn't something I needed to hide or overcome. It's something that connects me to my community, that adds depth to my perspective, that makes me uniquely qualified to do the work I do today. When I speak at conferences now, when I testify before Congress, when I meet with corporate executives who are scrambling to comply with federal equality standards, my accent carries the authority of someone who has lived the reality they're just beginning to understand. The truth is, Morrison & Associates didn't reject me because I wasn't qualified. They rejected me because they weren't ready for what qualification really looks like in the modern world. They weren't prepared for the future, and ironically, their discrimination against me helped ensure they would have to adapt to it, whether they wanted to or not. When I think about all the young professionals who will never have to experience what I experienced, who will walk into interview rooms where their accents are heard as assets rather than liabilities, where their diverse backgrounds are seen as competitive advantages rather than cultural complications, I feel a satisfaction that goes beyond personal vindication. But this story isn't really about me. It's about every Isabella Morales who now gets hired at companies that once would have dismissed her based on her last name. It's about every Roberto who no longer has to choose between authenticity and opportunity. It's about every professional who has been told they need to be more polished or better fit, simply because they don't match someone else's limited imagination about what excellence looks like. To every young professional reading this who has been made to feel like they don't belong, to every dreamer who has been told they're not the right fit, to every person who has been asked to make themselves smaller to make others comfortable, I want you to know this. Your difference is not your disadvantage. It's your superpower. They can mock your accent, but they can't silence your voice. They can question your place, but they can't diminish your purpose. They can try to make you smaller, but they can't stop you from growing. And most importantly, they can try to exclude you from their version of success, but they can't stop you from redefining what success actually means. The America my parents dreamed of when they crossed that border with 2 suitcases and unlimited hope isn't the America that existed then. It's the America we're building now. One policy change at a time. One conversation at a time. One brave professional at a time who refuses to accept that discrimination is just how things are. In the 5 years since my experience at Morrison & Associates, I've overseen investigations that have resulted in over $200 million in settlements and compliance agreements. I've helped rewrite federal guidelines for equal opportunity in hiring. I've testified before Congress about the economic impact of workplace discrimination. I've spoken at universities, corporations, and conferences around the world about the business case for authentic inclusion. But none of those accomplishments matter as much as the messages I receive from young professionals who tell me that their interviews went differently because of the work we've done, that their accents were celebrated rather than criticized, that their diverse perspectives were sought out rather than tolerated. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear, refuse to shrink, refuse to accept that someone else's limitation should become your reality. Refuse to let their narrow definition of acceptability determine your sense of self-worth. I am Elena Rodriguez. I speak with the voice of Texas and the wisdom of generations. I carry the dreams of my parents and the hopes of the next generation. I am exactly who I was meant to be, and no conference room, no matter how intimidating, no matter how exclusive, no matter how unwelcoming, will ever change that. When Morrison and Associates first saw my resume, they probably thought they were doing me a favor by granting me an interview. They thought they were being generous by giving someone like me a chance to prove herself in their world. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't trying to join their world. I was working to change it. The beautiful irony is that their rejection of me led to their federal investigation. Their discrimination against me resulted in their company paying millions in penalties. Their assumption that I wasn't sophisticated enough to represent their brand led to me becoming the federal official who now oversees their compliance with anti-discrimination laws. They thought they were evaluating my fit for their company. Instead, they discovered that their company wasn't fit for the future. And sometimes, that's exactly the lesson the world needs to learn. As I close this story, I want to leave you with the words my grandmother used to tell me when I was a little girl struggling with homework or playground bullies. Mija, they can try to dim your light, but they can't change the fact that you were born to shine. Every person who has ever been told they don't belong, every dreamer who has been dismissed before they could prove themselves, every professional who has been made to feel that their heritage is a handicap rather than a strength, you were born to shine. Shine so bright that their excuses become obviously false. Shine so bright that their systems have to change to accommodate your light. Shine so bright that the next generation never has to choose between authenticity and opportunity. Shine. Because the world needs your light more than it needs their approval. That's the lesson Morrison and Associates taught me, though I doubt it's the one they intended to impart. In trying to make me smaller, they actually helped me discover just how bright I was capable of shining. And I've been shining ever since.